Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for, I know there's people still coming in, so we'll watch that happen. But I wanted to thank you all for joining us for this afternoon's session on building resilient communities to withstand the increasing extreme weather events' impact on the global water crisis. That's one hell of a title, isn't it? I'm particularly keen that we've got this session here because one of the first challenges we identified when we were conceiving and developing the Water Institute at UNC was the idea that we are building infrastructures and systems and behaviors for the stable world of today, which may not be resilient to many of the shocks that not only are off in the future, but are actually affecting us already. For that reason, I mentioned this as one of those external factors in the plenary yesterday, and I think this is a very good follow-through on one specific example, weather extremes, and how they affect us and how we adapt to them. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce this conversation, and I look forward to seeing how the conversation evolves. The moderator for this session is John Matthews. John is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. That's hosted by the World Bank and the Stockholm International Water Institute. His own work blends technology and policy knowledge for climate adaptation and water management for practical implementation. And John will walk us through how the session will work and introduce us to the other speakers. John, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. My name is John Matthews, and this session, it has a risk. It has a risk that we could be talking in very abstract terms. What I'd like to do in the sessions that I've heard, I've been really refreshed over the course of this conference so far to hear lots of stories about places, about issues in very tangible places for very specific institutions. And especially on climate adaptation issues, there's often a deep tension that occurs between these levels. Most people that have been working on climate adaptation issues, like myself, we tend to try to think about large-scale solutions. How does a multilateral, a development bank, make its investment decisions, and how can we make sure that those are resilient? How can we think about water utilities so that they deliver consistent, secure, and clean water to the communities that they serve? But I also think that climate adaptation is really about how we make, as individuals, in our communities, in our institutions, different decisions, how we rebalance, we reprioritize. And I'd like for that to be the real theme for this session, how you can hear yourselves and my fellow panelists ideas, concepts that you can bring back into your own work. Because these, as Jamie pointed out, these are issues that are very present already. One of the times that this became most clear to me was in 2010. My wife and I were traveling to the Horn of Africa. We were adopting a little boy. And we went down into the African Rift Valley, and we met with his birth mother. And of course, the most natural question that we had was, why? Why are you giving this beautiful boy up for adoption? And she looked at us and she said, I'm a single mother. I live with my father. My mother is dead. We live in one room. And I worry about the next drought, that I will have to be the one who decides who eats. That was very moving to us. A few months later, a very strong El Nino was forecast. And it was one of the worst droughts, as many of you who have worked in the Horn know, one of the worst droughts and famines in the Horn for a long time. And I kept thinking about that when I read that news. You know, the kind of dry world of climate science and the individual decision that one woman trying to think ahead about how her landscape of issues, her landscape of decisions, literally her DNA was going to go in a completely different trajectory because of changes that we are making to the global climate system. So I'd like, with that, to be able to transition. The first speaker that we'll have, there's really just one talk with slides, but the first speaker is going to be Peter Glick. He's with the Pacific Institute. He founded it. He's someone that is, in my world, very famous and well-known, one of the first people to really articulate in a passionate and evidence and science-based way about the importance of a changing water cycle given the global climate system. Peter, I hand it over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, John, and thank you for that personal story. So one of the hardest things about speaking after lunch is watching an audience that has to listen to a talk after lunch. So if you close your eyes, I understand. If you snore, your neighbors will poke you, and so we'll keep an eye on that. So we're going to have a panel conversation after this. I'm looking forward to that. I've been asked to set the stage a little bit to talk about the framework, the background of climate change and water issues. I'm going to do that for just a few minutes. We're all familiar with SDG 6, this water audience, to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. There have been some fantastic talks already that I've heard, and all of you are working in one form or another in this. But as you also all know, there are a lot of SDGs. There are 17 of them. Number 13 is take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And the reality, of course, with the SDGs is that all of the SDGs are related. This is one of the advantages of the SDGs. One of the big differences from the Millennium Development Goals is that these things are interconnected, and you cannot address any of them really without addressing all of them to some degree. Water, as we know, is connected to everything we care about, to ecosystems, to human health, to climate, to agriculture and food production, to security, to poverty. And the reality is that climate is as well. We live in a climate. The planet has an envelope, and we survive within the climate dynamics of that planet. And we're changing the climate. A little bit of context for the water piece of this. Some people say, well, look, why bother? Water is a difficult enough problem all by itself. Why bother dealing with the climate piece of this? WASH is complicated. Climate change is a problem for the future. It's not going to be a big deal by 2030. You know, maybe 2050, 2100, the next generation. The connections between water and climate may be tenuous to some or unclear. And I'd like to challenge all of that. The truth is we deal with water and climate. We have to deal with water and climate because, first of all, climate can't be ignored any longer as a factor. It affects, as I mentioned, every one of the Sustainable Development Goals. It complicates implementation of the things that we care about on the water side in ways that I'll talk about in a moment. It complicates the sustainability of the efforts we make. When you do something and you don't take into account climate or a changing climate, the sustainability, the long-term effectiveness of what we're doing may be adversely affected. And ultimately, climate change and the impacts of climate change can help or hinder all of the efforts we make in WASH. I also note, although I'm not going to talk about this, but there have been some interesting talks already here, sustainable water management also can help reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. There are very strong connections between energy and water. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to move, use, clean, treat, disinfect the water resources that we require. It similarly takes a lot of water to provide much of the energy that the Earth uses. And so the connections between water and energy are pretty tight. And there are things that we can do to move towards sustainable water management that can reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases and reduce the severity of climate change. And I'm not going to talk about that piece of the puzzle, but we shouldn't forget that piece of the puzzle. So quickly, some water-related risks of climate change. I'm not going to give you a primer on climate dynamics and climate modeling and the complications thereof. But the hydrologic cycle that we all deal with and that you all remember from your early school days is the climate cycle. Evaporation, the formation of clouds, precipitation, runoff, back to the oceans and evaporation again. The hydrologic cycle is the climate cycle. And as we change the climate, we will fundamentally change water resources. We know it's going to get hotter and is already getting hotter pretty much everywhere all the time. The temperatures are going up at different rates in different places, but the trend is hotter. And hotter means more evaporation, more demand for water by ecosystems and by crops and by natural environments. It's going to get wetter and drier. And this is one of the big complications on the climate dynamic scene. Some places will get wetter and some places will get drier. And unfortunately, at the moment, the climate models suggest that the dry places are going to get drier and the wet places are going to get wetter, which is sort of the opposite of what we would like if we had a choice. And we don't really have a choice. But that's the way the Earth and the hydrologic cycle delivers water around the planet. Not everybody gets all the water we want, and it's going to get wetter and drier. And understanding where it gets wetter and where it gets drier is one of the big remaining challenges in climate science that we're still working with. And the weather is going to get more extreme. So the climate is the long-term average of the weather. The weather is what happens on a day-to-day basis. One way to think about this, if your friends say, look, what's the difference between weather and climate? There's a huge difference. And one way to think about it is weather determines what kind of clothes you put on in the morning. It's going to be hot, it's going to be cold today, it's going to be wet, it's going to be dry. Climate determines the kind of clothes that are in your closet. It's the long-term average. It's the extreme. And we have extremes of weather. And this is a photograph. It's from the new GEOS 16 satellite, which is sort of a remarkable new satellite just launched about a year and a half ago. And it shows Hurricane Katia and Irma and Jose, which then went further north in the Atlantic. It was after Harvey, which devastated part of Texas, and it was before Maria, which devastated much of the Caribbean. And of course, this year we've had 10 hurricanes. It's an unprecedented hurricane year. Right now, Ireland and England is dealing with the aftermath of Ophelia, the farthest north a hurricane has struck in the Atlantic in recorded history. We're going to see more extremes. Broadly speaking, we have to think about climate in the context of water quantity and water availability, in terms of the impacts of climate change on water quality, on extreme events, on human health, and on all sorts of other things, on availability of water for food, for natural ecosystems. And I'm going to just touch on a couple of these very quickly. The other issue here is that climate change is not something for 2050 and 2100. Climate change is already influencing water resources. It's already affecting temperature, precipitation, extreme events. This is a reality of today. And it's influencing extreme events. And I italicize the word influencing here because the issue is not whether or not climate change caused any particular extreme event or a hurricane that came off the Atlantic. That's a debate. There's a lot of interesting science going on about causality in extreme events. But much more clear is that climate change is influencing extreme events. Higher sea surface temperatures makes hurricanes stronger than they would otherwise be. Higher temperatures means hurricanes have more moisture in them than they would otherwise have. Higher sea level means that storm surges and flooding is more severe than it would otherwise be. And that's the role of influence of climate change on extreme events. And we're seeing more and more of those influences. In terms of quality and availability, an example from today, basically. This is the statistics as of this morning. Puerto Rico currently is suffering the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And at the moment, 28% of the customers of the organized water system in Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rico Aqueduct and Sewer Authority, still do not have access to safe water. And a substantial portion of Puerto Rico's population doesn't get service anyway from the organized municipal utility, but from hundreds of small water systems in rural parts of Puerto Rico. And many of these communities haven't even been reached yet by adequate surveys or by adequate aid, and we don't know the extent to which they have available safe water systems. In addition, more than half of the wastewater treatment systems in Puerto Rico are running on generators because the electrical system, and that's again an example of the connection between water and energy vulnerability, the energy system has not been adequately restored. And so wastewater treatment, collection has been very severely affected by that extreme event. There are other health-related consequences that we're beginning to learn about. This is a graph that basically shows two things. It shows cholera incidence and sea surface temperature in the Bay of Bengal. And what it is telling us is that as sea surface temperatures go up, the incidences of cholera in the area in Bangladesh around the Bay of Bengal go up. Higher temperatures, more water-related diseases. Understanding the connections between climate change, temperature, precipitation, extreme events, and human health is a critical piece of this puzzle. And another example, again, from Puerto Rico, a substantial number of people who don't have access to reliable water are now getting water from wells that we know are associated with Superfund contaminated sites. And they're not doing that because they want to. They're doing that because they, at the moment, have no other choice. On the economic side of this, probably the first thing to say is that our understanding of the economic consequences of climate change is terrible. We don't understand those costs or barely how to measure them. But there have been a few estimates. One estimate is that global climate change adaptation costs for providing sufficient water to meet future demand for public water supply and industrial demand by 2050 will be around $12 billion a year. That's the incremental costs of climate change over the next couple of centuries. And I think that number is incredibly low. I think that's way underestimated. And the vast majority of these costs, perhaps no surprise to any of you, won't be borne by the developed world, but by the developing world, where already systems are vulnerable. And as I suggested, many costs of climate change for water resources and many other things are completely unquantified. And so when you hear the argument, climate change is too expensive to deal with because we have to radically transform our energy system, that's part of the equation. I think that statement alone is false. But the other part of the equation is, what are the costs of failing to deal with climate change? What are the costs that we're going to have to deal with in terms of impacts? So, in summary, water is central to human development and ecosystem health. We understand that, and we already understand we're not managing water adequately. Water is central to the Sustainable Development Goals, not just SDG 6, but across all of those Sustainable Development Goals. We are increasingly manipulating the climate with particularly high risks to water resources and hydrology and water systems. Climate change is going to complicate the implementation of the things that we're all working on and the sustainability of those things. It's difficult enough to think about long-term sustainability of some of the projects under a stable climate, and the climate is no longer stable. And we need integrated science and analysis and policy in this context. There are solutions, and we're going to talk about these a little bit, I think, in the Q&A and in the panel conversation. Obviously, the first is meeting human and ecosystem basic needs for water. We have to integrate water across the broad SDG objectives. I think we have to rethink what we mean by supply and demand. Supply used to mean building a big dam, and it used to mean building an aqueduct to move water from a distant river basin or drilling another groundwater well. But there are new ways of thinking about supply in terms of wastewater reuse, in terms of stormwater capture, that will make us more resilient in the long run to climate variability. And we need to rethink demand and the efficiency with which we use water, and that's a separate talk. We need to rethink wastewater treatment technology and policy. We need to reorganize our institutions so that we're no longer just dealing with water institutions over here and energy institutions over there and food institutions somewhere else, but to integrate our institutional management of these issues. And then finally, on climate change, we really have three options, and this is one way of describing it. We can mitigate, we can adapt, or we can suffer. We can mitigate as in reduce the severity of the problem by cutting greenhouse gases. We can adapt, and we'll have to adapt to those climate changes that we cannot mitigate, we cannot prevent. Or we can suffer, and ultimately, the only question is what's going to be the ratio among those three issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. I'd like to introduce the other two panelists. Tony Wong comes to us from Australia, Monash University, and he's an engineer, so he works especially on cities. He's with the Cooperative Research Center for Water-Sensitive Cities and brings, I think, a very broad view of engineering to his work. Then we also have Lun Via from Zanmi La Sante. You might know its sister organization, Partner in Health. She's based in Haiti and runs the largest non-governmental health organization. I'd like to actually, for the benefit of the panelists, I'd actually like to begin by asking you in the audience a couple of questions. How many of you currently have climate change as an existing practical element of your work, either policy or on the ground? Raise your hand. That's impressive. That's probably 80, 90% of the audience. I'm curious as well, how many of you feel that climate and resilience are words that or let's say that resilience assumes a climate change component? Raise your hand, yes or no? Yes? Okay, that's also an overwhelming majority. And maybe one additional question. How many of you think that water plays an essential role in the process of thinking about resilience? Yes, raise your hand. I would say that's a universal agreement. Okay, now it may seem a little bit like the start of a joke that two scientists, Peter, myself, an engineer, and a public health person walked into a room to talk about resilience. But we actually hope to expand that to you all as quickly as possible, bring in some questions from the floor. So I'd like to actually start off with Tony. Tony, if you could talk a little bit about how you see the concept of resilience really playing out in the way that we think about cities, about the urban landscape.
Thank you, John. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge Jamie and his team for your invitation. This is my first experience with this community. I generally work in looking at transforming cities to build a much stronger sustainability and resilience in cities. But in reflecting on what I've heard the last couple of days and climate change, it's really interesting to note that climate change or the climate challenge is invariably a water challenge. Now, so many of the symptoms of climate change we see manifested in the water environment. Whether you are in drought or whether you're in flood, you see that happen all the time. From a city context and from the resilience context, I think that often we look at building resilience from two perspectives, and we constantly try and strike the right balance between the two. The issue of infrastructure resilience. How do you build infrastructure that is sufficiently robust to deal with the uncertainty that climate change brought about? But we also need to build social resilience. How does a community become a lot more aware of the uncertainties that they need to deal with now? How do they change their behavior, perhaps? Or how do they organize themselves such that they would recover from some of those extreme events that we see? And in a city environment, I like to sort of bring another perspective of climate change, one from the acute events that we see to the more chronic occurrences of climate change that is quite often too subtle for us to notice on a day-by-day basis. But they are, in fact, that invisible stressor on the most poor and vulnerable amongst us in cities that often goes about unnoticed. And one of which is, of course, this whole issue of rising sea levels, increasing level of inundation in some of the most vulnerable areas where perhaps our informal settlements and our poor actually live in. My observation walking around is that more and more of the WASH solution are put into significantly vulnerable conditions because of the fact of rising sea levels, that the soil is much more regularly saturated than you would imagine because of that. And therefore, the assimilative capacity of the environment to assimilate the waste stream from WASH solutions are significantly diminished as a result of that. And you see that. You see as I walk around in those communities that there is more and more contamination of the environment as a result of that failing system. And that gets exacerbated by climate change because of more regular inundation and more local flood events generated. One of the things about floods, no matter how big or small they are, is that they do redistribute the contamination back into the community. So the relationship between what you do in WASH within the household and how that relates to the environment that people live in, and how that contamination is constantly being redistributed because of climate change, is now, I believe, one of the single most significant challenge to the effectiveness of WASH in the urban community. So that for me, is a chronic effect of climate change that quite often is very discriminate in terms of the impact, the section of the community it impacts, compared to perhaps some of the more extreme events, which is perhaps a lot less discriminate. It's going to wipe out a whole city, no matter whether you are the poor and vulnerable or whatever. It's going to knock out your wastewater treatment plant. But in reality, in those communities that do not have a wastewater treatment plant, it is actually constantly, on a daily basis, redistributing the fecal contamination in the environment. And the other thing that I like to finish off on in terms of climate change is the notion that increased temperature actually increases the abundance of vectors, especially in the tropics. And that itself is also a significant impact on the health of those communities. So climate change actually has got quite a wide range of connotations. Our response to it in terms of building resilience is a combination of infrastructure response and social resilience response. And quite often you find that in dealing with some of the chronic impacts of climate change, there are things you can do from an infrastructure perspective combined with some of the social resilience. For the extreme events, I think the emphasis has got to shift back to how community as a whole respond to those challenges, and strengthening social resilience, I think is really, really important.
That's really interesting. I think your definition of social resilience is coming very close to Peter's comments about soft paths, making sure that we're thinking about the institutions, how they interact with each other, how we see communities and organizations that are able to respond, ideally anticipate I also really like this contrast that you're making between extreme events, which is in the description of this session, but also thinking about the kind of slow, gradual impacts which may have an important long-term effect. So that those long-term impacts probably have an inordinate effect on infrastructure, but we probably have to respond to them through the social resilience, bringing both of those together. Luna, in your work in Haiti for the past 30 years or so, you must have a very deep vision of what resilience can and should like, one that probably goes far beyond the concept of climate change and resilience, especially given some of the recent non-climate related extreme events that have occurred in Haiti. How do you view resilience?
Thank you, John, Peter, and Tony for including me in this panel. You asked me to say a few words about Haiti, about example of communities impacted by extreme weather. All I can say in a few words is that Haiti, as a country, is a very resilient country with communities. Example, in 2008, we had 4 major hurricanes. And we had the earthquake in January 2010, cholera ongoing since October 2010, and Matthew, October last year. We have a few weeks left until the end of the hurricane season, and we have been spared and feel very lucky that we're spared from Maria, Irma, and so on. But unfortunately, we are not well prepared as a country to face extreme weather, which we know will come. And at Partners in Health, we have seen more and more that the marginalized communities are the ones impacted by the extreme weather. Climate change and flooding exacerbate more our situation with poor water and sanitation. And more than 50% of Haiti as a country have no wash infrastructure. So I'm here to learn from the experts on what needs to be done, what can we do to help Haiti. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Peter, over your long career, you mentioned just before we started talking that your dissertation on the snowpack in the western mountains of North America was from 1987?
86.
86, okay. That's a long time in this world around climate change and water management. Most people really just go back a few years. I'm curious, do you feel optimistic about progress over that period? I think it's very easy to kind of fall into the habit of talking about disasters or endemic and deep problems, but do you also feel a sense of progress and momentum?
So in general, I'm an optimistic kind of a guy. I have to admit the last 9 months have been a little trying. The bad news, of course, is that we haven't solved all of our water problems. I would like to think that over the last many decades we would have made more progress than we've made. But we've made a lot of progress, and I've been having a great time at this conference just because of the numbers of people and the excitement and the quality of the people. There is a much bigger water community now than 30 years ago, and it's a much more integrated, smart water community now. And we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about what doesn't work and what does work, and how to move forward. And you know the expression in English, it's not rocket science. It's supposed to be, oh, something's easier because it's not rocket science. Rocket science is easy compared to what we have to deal with in the water community. It's hard. We're dealing with people and communities, and not just hydrology and climate science, but But people and social systems is much more difficult. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think we're moving in the right direction. I wish the Millennium Development Goals had been 100% access was the target. Now the Sustainable Development Goals are, and you know, I'm sure we won't meet all of them, but it's the right objective. We now, unfortunately, have the complication of climate change. And so the question is not just, do we have to do the things we were going to do anyway, but are there new things that we ought to be doing that are different because of climate change? I think that's an unresolved question, but it's related to this issue of resilience and social systems and extreme events. So I guess I wish we were in a better place, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
Tony, do you feel that cities are making different decisions, maybe than they did 5 or 10 years ago, in keeping with either climate impacts that they've already felt or that they feel may be coming in the future?
In fact, my experience is, in fact, they are. And one of the motivations for me wanting to spend more of my time working in the developing world, having actually spent a lot of time working in the developed world, is that there are many, many nations in the developed world that are reinventing themselves to build stronger resilience. You know, they have gone down an institutional pathway that is very much based around centralized solutions, big dependency on energy, and so on. And they're trying to redefine themselves. So the whole issue of creating a greater diversity of water sources to deal with climate change, a greater understanding of including nature-based solutions. And so my past career in the last 20 years have been looking at how we would adapt the developed world and transition it into a more sustainable future. And a few years ago, I tend to realize that a lot of the developing world have this great opportunity to leapfrog a lot of the conventional approach that the developed world have gone through, and that they are not impeded by a lot of the institutional construct that the developed world have found themselves locked into. And yet, when we work in the developing world, the only thing they aspire for, I find, is to be like the developed world. And so I find it a real opportunity for us to learn from what the developed world are trying to do in reinventing themselves and actually enable the developing world to leapfrog through all of those nonsense and actually get to this whole new, more decentralized solution, more diversity of different water sources on a fit-for-purpose basis, that you don't need one source of water for everything. That in itself presents to the developing world a great opportunity to create a stronger resilience outcome than where the developing world to get a stronger resilience outcome than where the developed world are at the moment. You know, the developing world have got a much stronger social resilience culture than the developed world at the moment. And quite often on reflection, the developed world's attention to structural resilience have in itself designed out the social resilience component of the community. And I think that we have this opportunity in the developing world to try and bring the two together. So I think that there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from what the developed world are trying to do to unscramble the demise they find themselves, and helping guide the developing world to build infrastructure in a way that avoids a lot of this.
Yeah, very interesting. I like this idea that there may be a different vision or implementation of what resilience might look like in the developing world as opposed to the developed world, that it may actually be kind of a core concept between our vision for what development should really look like. Loon, we have I'm a biologist. In biology, we would say is almost a kind of natural experiment that's occurring in the Caribbean right now between Puerto Rico and Haiti as a close neighbor. And Haiti, when most people think about Haiti, they often think of it as a place where terrible things happen, yet it's a country that has a deep and very proud and really inspiring history too. I'm curious, when we look at Puerto Rico, it's I think a great example of what Tony was just talking about. It's part of the U.S., at least in theory, part of the U.S. Is a place that has complex, developed world solutions and systems that should be a very deep reservoir of resilience for the economy and for the communities there. But we are also seeing a sudden vulnerability that maybe we weren't aware of in Puerto Rico right now, in our ability to reconstruct, reconnect those systems. Whereas in Haiti, maybe there's a different type of resilience that communities have. Someone may lose their house, but maybe their clean water source is damaged. Maybe a clinic is hurt in the short run, but it may also be an easier system that's designed to say fail gently and be reconstructed quickly. Do you have thoughts on the examples that we see playing out in real time now?
I mentioned last year we had Matthew, and we had two departments, Uganda and the South, that I would say 90% destroy. But if you go back now, you'll see people, after like a few weeks, they start rebuilding their houses, they start, they continue their lives. They said, so they don't stop. They don't wait for NGOs or international community to help them. They just, they keep going with their lives. And we kind of joke, I mean, it's not a good joke, but in Haiti, when we hear on the news that in Florida, they don't have power for days, or they don't have food, and some people in Haiti, they joke, they say, this is our situation, this is our everyday life, so we, get on it, just get, and, but, I mean, I said it's a sad joke because we don't want that. In Puerto Rico, I have some colleagues, friends in the audience, they told me they went to Puerto Rico, and it's worse than the earthquake in Haiti, worse than Matthew in Haiti last year. So, and I know, it's different countries, different ways to live, go on with your lives, and different way to see things. And when you expectation also. I think in Haiti, we don't expect that like people are gonna come and rebuild the houses and the water system, but we go on with our lives. I don't know if it's clear or.
No, I think okay. That's very clear, yes. Thank
John,
you.
So I wonder if we need to start thinking that all of our systems are maybe more vulnerable than we understand, that a sufficiently extreme shock of any kind can push us past a margin that we didn't anticipate. Developed or developing. And that the idea of resilience is the ability to, roughly, to plan and prepare and restore from some kind of extreme event. And one of the challenges of climate change is that it's changing the nature of extreme events. And so the kinds of extreme events that we're used to, so as a hydrologist, I'm taught to expect a certain kind of flood in a region, and it's based on the historical record. I get 30 years or 100 years, if I'm lucky, of data from what the past hydrology was like, and that tells me, or an engineer, how to build a dam or a flood control system. And that's what we prepare for. But now climate change is telling us, or ought to be telling us, that those statistics aren't relevant anymore. and that not only should we perhaps prepare for more extreme events, but different kinds of events. And I think Tony mentioned vectors. So what's the ability of the continental United States to deal with dengue or malaria, which isn't prevalent anymore there, but with rising temperatures might be? These are new extreme events, and I think it has to change the way we think about resilience.
I very much agree. One of the useful additions, I think, to the resilience debate that I've heard over the past few years has been the introduction of the word transformation. That there are some conditions that certain parts of the world are already facing, but probably all of us over the next 50 years will be facing, that are so new that a place that seems familiar to us becomes profoundly unfamiliar. And that we actually, we have organized most of our systems through this traditional approach to economic development by looking backwards as a way to inform the future. The scientific term for that is stationarity, that the past will be a good predictor of the future. But transformation is a really powerful and deep idea, and it says that actually we need to be prepared for futures that are very difficult for us to be able to articulate and sometimes even to envision. And that often requires a different body of techniques and approaches. Starting around 2007, 2008, I started to become aware of a number of initiatives, mostly technical, really coming out of areas like engineering and hydrology to try and move into a non-stationary framework for how we manage water resources. And it's interesting to see a leap that's, I think, starting to occur even in the developed world, actually, towards thinking about how we should talk about the future and actually use it as a way to bring in additional stakeholders, even to bring in ecosystems, the environment more generally, as a more useful integrated mechanism. I saw a cartoon a few years ago that said that, what if we make the world a better place and then climate change doesn't happen? And I actually think that we're starting to see climate change as this kind of more powerful integrating force that can actually help tie together and serve as a kind of glue between a number of often disparate issues and sectors that we've had difficulty getting sometimes people just to sit around the table together. I wonder if in your work, Tony, that's something that you've seen with cities.
Well, we are, but I'm almost embarrassed to say that in Australia, it's not necessarily leading the world in terms of its climate change policy. And so to some degree, the whole question of climate change is quite a polarizing discussion. But what is not polarizing is some of the impacts that we see. And often it is not getting bogged down with the ideology of whether climate change is human-induced or what. It's much better to actually look at how do we strengthen solutions and community resilience to uncertainties. Because if there's anything that is certain about climate change is that it is uncertain, that we are no longer able to predict probabilities of future events. So the new sort of trend of analysis is very much based around scenario planning, for us to envisage what the future scenario might be, and then to test the type of systems we have to see how it would withstand those scenarios. And for that, it's a really good way of engaging community to talk about future scenarios. And it could be quite far-fetched, but to be able to test both the infrastructure system as well as the social system in how it would respond to those scenarios. I think that we will end up moving much more towards community-based co-development of strategy. The top-down approach and the highly centralized solution is, I think, very much a thing of the past now. So yes, it can bring community closer together as long as we can create the narrative that is not about the ideology of climate change, but actually about dealing with some of the uncertainties that we face. And that has much more traction than talking about the ideology of climate change.
Well spoken. Let's turn to the audience. If some of you have burning questions, maybe about your own work or climate policy, perhaps the upcoming COP that will be in Bonn. So we'll take 3 questions and then turn to the panel. So I have one person here.
Microphones are on
okay,
the sides.
microphones are near the double doors. So we'll start with you, sir, then you, ma'am, and then there was a woman over here.
So if I could, before we get the questions, one quick comment. I agree with Tony's point completely about communications. I'm picky about the phrasing. Climate change is not an ideology. Climate change is science. The ideology in this debate is the climate deniers.
Sure.
That's ideology. But the point about how we communicate is a critical one. And in some cases, it may not be useful to talk about climate change in a community, but to talk about extreme events and to talk about resilience.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make that minor point.
All right, yes, sir.
Hi, this is Nadeem from Moderator, and I have a question to Peter, that the climate community and the action that's attributed to climate from the global community getting momentum. There's a lot of money being put for that. But when I see the national determined contribution sent by the government, there's not much on WASH in those, which means there's a disconnect between the people in a country level who look after climate and there's the people who are associated with the WASH. Likewise, if I see COP23 side events, there are 200 plus side events. There's only one side event on WASH from Nepal. So how do we bridge this gap between the WASH community and the people who are associated with the climate change? Because when I see the action happening in climate, the WASH is completely missing. What's your take on that? Thank you.
Great. We'll take all the questions. Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead.
If you could say your name and affiliation too,
Clarissa
please.
Brocklehurst, and I'm with the UNC Water Institute. So my question is to Tony. And I was intrigued by what you have said about leapfrogging in cities in the developing world, particularly as this is a pretty nerdy crowd, all engineers and scientists, and also a crowd that is often called upon to give advice to developing, to cities in the developing world. And so I was wondering if I could press you for some of the specifics. I found very tantalizing your mention of nature-based solutions. So I would really love it if you could give some examples of what you've seen that works in terms of nature-based solutions, but also expand a bit on this idea of how we can advise cities to manage to leapfrog in their development of water-related solutions.
Fantastic.
Hi, my name is Erin Huber. I'm with Drink Local, Drink Tap. I work in Uganda, and I see more and more refugees coming in from Congo, South Sudan, many different places. And in addition to already the troubles that they have, we're having more of a demand on water resources, food resources. Can you talk a little bit about climate refugees? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question.
Yeah, thank you. Mark Dedman with the Global Environment Technology Foundation. And we're here at Science Meets Policy. And I wanted to, climate change, collective action problem, water, a lot of collective action, and same with health. But I also feel like, Donald Trump is also a collective action problem that has been testing my own personal resilience as well over the several months. But I'd like to hear you talk, I guess, at the national level on how do we start changing the dialogue and debate at that level where it seems like a lot of cheaper political shots are being taken at science. The scientific process, there's always going to be uncertainty. That's how we progress. But it seems like the word evidence-based and science has now become a bad thing to say and to engage, and it seems like it's almost under attack. And I'm just looking to your thoughts on, how do we counterattack that or change it at the grassroots level trying to encourage even scientists, to run for political office, so we can start changing that dialogue to be more constructive, and we can get serious on working towards action on the ground.
Super, thanks, Mark. Let's hold off on more questions until we work through this, and then we'll see if we can bring in some other folks. Peter, I believe the first question was directed to you, thinking about water, especially in the nationally determined contributions as part of the Paris Agreement, and what about this gap that seems to exist between the climate community, maybe the broader water community, and WASH in particular?
Yeah, I agree completely. It's a problem, and I don't necessarily have a solution. The water community is very big and diverse, and the climate community is pretty big as well. And there's not a lot of communication. I think it would help if the climate community knew better what information the water community broadly wanted and needed as they develop models and analyses and studies. Because we all, in the water community, we need information about certain kinds of things. I'd love to know for any particular region if precipitation is going to go up or down, or runoff or availability is going to go up or down, or how water quality is going to be affected. So the more that the water community can talk to the climate community and say, look, this is what I need to know. And conversely, I think the water community should say to the climate community, here's the climate information that I really need to know. There needs to be more interaction. And I think that would help improve our understanding and reduce the scientific uncertainties that are out there. It's just a piece of the puzzle. It's not the political piece related to the Paris Agreement, but as some of you know, there's going to be a big water presence at the next Conference of the Parties, at the next COP. There is starting to be that kind of communication.
Any others want to?
Well, I only want to add to that I come from the water sector, and even within the water sector, WASH is only a relatively small component of the big business of water. And so it's not surprising that when we talk about climate change and water scarcity and water vulnerability, the big end of town is talking about their own resilience from what might be a highly developed, highly matured water sector. And so it is not surprising that you find that the climate change discussions amongst the people at the big end of town is more about how do you secure the greater certainty of what they already have, while the WASH community is trying to struggle with how they can be provided with more even without the climate change. And now climate change is in fact exacerbating the problem that they have. But that's not widely discussed. And that's why for me it's incredibly refreshing to be in this community, which is my first exposure to this, to sort of look at the context of the challenge at the other end. Where how do you build resilience when you are starting from a very low base? And I see great opportunities.
Loon, do you? Okay. I haven't really talked very much about my organization, AGWA, Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. We're a global network of a little over 1,000 water and climate professionals. And one of the interesting things that has occurred over the 7.5 years or so that we've been around is that the policy community has really reached out to us on a consistent basis, really trying to kind of pull us in as we've talked about, what should be the new best practices for resilient water management. And so we've been involved very actively in a number of COPs, and including the very first Water Day that occurred in Morocco last year. And we're one of the organizers for the Water Day that's going to occur in the COP year with 3 other organizations. And I've been really struck by this gap that you're talking about between water and climate change. When I think about water in particular at the broadest level, I think of water as a connector. It's a resource. It underlays whole economies. But when the UNFCCC thinks about water, they call it a sector. So when I hear sector, I hear pipes and pumps. That's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about how you cannot accomplish either the climate mitigation or the climate adaptation goals, or especially, as Peter pointed out, the SDGs, without basically making sure that all those goals float on a reservoir of water. Some of the NDCs do a pretty good job. About 85, 90% of the NDCs mention water on some level. Some are spectacular. Egypt has a very, very good one that talks about water as a resource in this way. They talk about water in a transboundary sense even, and how it runs through all of their development goals, all of their climate goals. They touch on energy, ecosystems, cities, everything. But that's still rare. So what I'm really hoping is that we can start to make stronger connections exactly along the lines that you're talking about. And I think as we move from talking about NDCs as national aspirations to a whole bunch of projects that are supposed to feed into those NDCs, that we can also bring in this kind of bigger vision, because it's not countries that implement much of these NDCs. It's a city, it's a community, it's probably Loon's group, and they're the ones that really have to articulate and make that presence really felt on the ground. So an excellent question. I also like to turn to your question about leapfrogging. That was directed towards Tony.
I might start answering the question by making some reference to nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions is perhaps a fashionable word, but it really is about understanding natural processes. And the best way to think about it is that when the world was of 2 billion people, it was quite easy for us to think about how our waste stream is being discharged, and that the environment will look after the waste stream, in that there is actually a natural assimilative capacity. That assimilative capacity is actually based on the ecology of the environment, and how systems like wetlands, for instance, which is something that I've studied for nearly 15 years, that there are processes where the hydrology of the wetland influences the ecology of the wetland, and it's the ecology of the wetland that actually does a lot of the assimilation of waste. So what we've done with urbanization in the developed world is actually remove a lot of that natural capital. We build on top of it. And what we see today in many of the cities, and cities that I've worked with, is that we are now working very hard to reintroduce a lot of that nature-based system back into it. We are building wetlands in cities that are part of the landscape to try and function as if they were the kidneys of our city. So the whole idea of leapfrogging in the developing world is that how do you actually go about preserving those natural capital rather than destroying it in the process of bringing the developing world up to the developed world. So that is really some of the concepts of leapfrogging, that we can avoid the type of investment that the developed world, like Singapore, for instance, are investing in re-establishing natural capital and ecological landscapes into their urban environment, while in the developing world, we can actually start to think about taking advantage of those and preserving them. The science that we have is that we now understand how to mimic and how to promote those natural processes in a way that enable it to perhaps take a smaller footprint while still be incredibly efficient in the way that it does its ecosystem service, of which includes the cleansing of water, the cleansing of wastewater. So the whole concept of how we can think about using nature-based solution to enable developing world to leapfrog over a lot of the conventional practices is something that's emerging at the moment.
Oh, excellent. Loon, are there examples in your organization's work where you have tried to work with, say, the natural landscape as a way to really reinforce and strengthen your public health work?
Actually, we work more on health, but for water, we work with the local authorities on DINEPA on water. We have some colleagues, some partners there. I'm looking at David and Daniel, that they work more on water in the community. So.
Excellent. As a biologist, I'm really struck by a gap between systematic knowledge that we can kind of hand over to an engineer or to an implementing agency about ecosystems or hybrid infrastructure, and the real demand and need for it. And I think that's been a consistent issue. There are a few positive signs. Tony and I will be in Manila next week with the Asian Development Bank, and they've been one of the real innovators, I think, in trying to implement nature-based solutions in a more systematic way, trying to gather that information together. I'd like to turn to Aaron's question about Uganda and the idea of climate refugees. Peter.
Yeah, so climate refugees is a great example of one of these threshold nonlinear kinds of events. We plan for demographic change, we plan for population growth. We don't plan for massive dislocations of populations. And there are going to be, some could argue there already are, climate refugees. And they're going to change the fundamental political and social and economic conditions in a lot of different regions, and we're not thinking about that very well. I would argue that part of the Syrian problem originated with drought and population displacement internally to Syria, but we're going to see island nations disappear, we're going to see coastal flooding. People are leaving Puerto Rico now and may not come back, and maybe they'll move to states where they're needed. It's a serious issue, and I don't think we've planned for it. If I could make one comment about the assault on science question. It's one of the most disturbing things in the last few years, the growing assault. It's not just on science, it's on information and fact. Scientists are not trained typically to communicate. They're not trained to get involved in politics, and I'm not suggesting that those of you who are in the sciences do that. That's not part of what we do. But on the other hand, the more scientists in Congress, the more scientists who speak out to the public and go to public meetings and talk to members of the public and communicate what we know and what we don't know and what we think, the better. I like to think the assault on science is going to be temporary, but we need to push back against it, and that's going to require a different way of thinking for some of us.
If I could add to that, there was a session yesterday talking about collaboration and collaboration in advocacy, for instance. And I feel that this is where the scientists can really add a lot of value in providing the evidence to strengthen advocacy. I think more and more you find that you can no longer pull on the heartstring to win a debate or a discussion in this highly competitive world for resources. So as a scientist and as coming from a university, we are constantly reminded that our work need to, in some way, be articulated in a form that would enable someone to advocate for the evidence that you've provided. So that there is a role for a scientist to step up to that challenge, just as there is a role for policymakers to actually be a lot more rigorous in how they use evidence in developing policy. I mean, there is also often a lot of policy made in the absence of evidence, and I think that the two really could come together in that regard.
I'm reminded of a great quote from Voltaire that illusion is always the first pleasure, which I take to mean in this case that sometimes what we want to have true is very comforting, and that we don't necessarily need to follow that. And I would say it's maybe not just an assault on science. I'd say maybe more generally it's an assault on technical knowledge. And I would say that many of you fall into that category, whether you have a scientific orientation or not. And in the sense that often it's the technical person's responsibility to stand up and say, I have some bad news to deliver. we need to make a different decision today. That doesn't work anymore. We need to shift our program in keeping with these new insights and new ideas. I suspect it's also a very scalable problem. I suspect that often with your colleagues, your programs, that Loon, that you have people that you work with on the field, maybe some of the medical personnel who come to you and they say, you know, this is a problem that we can fix, but it's going to be hard. And it's a real challenge to us with this clinic, with this community.
And more often is we have this problem, but we don't have the funding.
Yes.
More often that's the financial resources that we don't have to fix the problem.
That's right. So sometimes we know we have the diagnosis, but we have some fundamental obstacle to actually moving to the prescription.
That's correct. Yeah.
All right. I'd like to ask each one of my panelists to give just a couple of minutes a response. If you could say something about how maybe your vision of resilience might fit in with the WASH community in general, maybe a talk that you heard here, or an idea, even a question that's occurred in the course of this session. I'd like to start with Peter and go to Loon and end with Tony.
I wish you had started the other end. I'm not sure explicitly what else to add, except that I do think we're moving in the right direction. I think there's a better appreciation of the interconnected nature of these problems. Universities are beginning to be more interdisciplinary. Our NGOs are beginning to be more interdisciplinary because these are complicated challenges. And we know we're not going to solve the climate problem just by dealing with the climate community. We're not going to solve the water problem unless we deal with energy and ecosystems and human health. And the idea of resilience is core to all of that. If we can design our institutions and our communities to be resilient in the classic definition of being able to prepare for and recover from extremes, and if we do it understanding that the extremes of tomorrow were different in some ways, then I think we'll be better off.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you, the audience, and this is my first year, but my colleague Liz always told me about this great network of people working on water and health, and up to, wash and health, because we tend to separate health and wash, but it's one. Without wash, you can't have a better health. So I want to thank you for your commitment and to meet all these great people, great organizations working on wash and health. And tomorrow I'll be talking more about Haiti and the challenges we're facing at a panel at 1 p.m. Thank you.
Look, I just want to make the point that water or wash and health is of course intrinsically linked, but one of the key interface of that linkage is in fact the environment. It's the environment we are in, and climate change just complicates it many folds because of how that is impacting on that very interface between wash and health, the environment. And I think that it is definitely a multidisciplinary endeavor. And if anything, it needed to be interdisciplinary in the sense that every discipline really needs to understand the perspectives of all the other disciplines in coming together and bringing together a solution in that regard. And finally, resilience is building resilience in community has got to be a balanced approach between the infrastructure resilience and the social resilience. And I think that the sooner we actually get on to that, the better it is to see how best to strike the right balance between investing in infrastructure resilience and investing in building social and institutional resilience.
Thank you. For myself, I'd really like to reinforce this concept of transformation that I mentioned earlier. And I actually think that the topic of climate refugees is a really good application of that. A few years ago, I was at a talk. I was listening to a bird biologist, and she had a beautiful figure. And she was showing how bird migration in one part of North America had been changing over the past few decades. And she said, here are the birds in the middle that they haven't changed when they migrate. Here are the ones that are migrating earlier. Here are the ones that are migrating later. And she said, isn't that awful that these bird species are changing in how they migrate? And my response, I think, was really different from hers in how I looked at exactly the same data. I thought, you know, the birds I'd be worried about are the ones that aren't changing. And that's the real difficulty, I think, with climate change, is that we often have a really deep sense that we need to keep doing the same thing we did 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. We need to think about how, in an uncertain and shifting landscape, we might need to be making different decisions. In that sense, I know it's very controversial to say, even a topic like climate refugees may be, in some ways, a form of adaptation. It's very moving. I do a lot of work in Sweden to see people in many Swedish communities, often teenagers or the elderly, come to train stations to greet Syrian refugees, to bring them a basket of food and say, welcome, this is your new home, we're glad you're here. And that's a really powerful message for what really is a kind of remixing of the world. It's not the first time it's happened in human history either. We just happen to be lucky enough to live in a very interesting period. So with that, if we could have a round of applause for the panelists.